Very good. I don't know if you want to introduce. Folks, for my students for whom this is an extra credit assignment, because their class is normally on Thursday, there's a row at the back of that aisle that you can sign on the way out. Also, at the back of each aisle, there are some handouts. It's just a 4-page handout, and probably more of them are going to be at the back of that aisle because most people seem to have been coming in the other side. But if you don't happen to get a handout, that's fine, because I have a PowerPoint of essentially the main points that are incorporated into that handout. So I don't know if you want to say anything, or shall I just start?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, good morning to you. I guess I'm introducing myself. I'm Victor Borowski. I am from the Baltimore area. I've been teaching as an adjunct since the early 90s. I did my undergraduate work at a liberal arts college in Kentucky called Asbury College, which is now a university, which most of you have never heard of, but it gets very good write-ups in things like Newsweek. Did my graduate work in 2 places, some at the University of Kentucky and some at Thomas Jefferson's University, the University of Virginia. Came back to my hometown. I'm a product of the Baltimore City public school system, and have been teaching at various colleges in the area since about 1993. One of the things that we used to teach ethics students, and for some reason, at Hartford Community College, where I taught for years, we used to pack them in ethics courses because I think they had the same credit as if they were taking an intro to philosophy course. So because of the way it was set up, we taught a lot of specific ethics courses. And I used to use a little text by William Frankena. Well, he laid out the general form of ethical reasoning, and he illustrated it with an incident in the life of Socrates. And I got to thinking, when I was asked to do this paper, about things that I'm interested in, one of which is the whole climate change issue. And one of the things that was prominent in that model of an ethical argument is the place of facts. And so that's what I'm going to center around. You're going to see that my answer is ethics only about ethics is going to be basically no. If you're going to look at applied ethics, the reasoning in applied ethics brings into play a lot of particular facts. And the assumption is, well, okay, moral principles, we should keep our promises. We ought to keep our agreements. We ought not to cause undue harm to someone. We should do no murder. Those seem to be abstract and ethereal, but facts, they're down to earth. We can verify facts by observational methods. But one of the focuses of my paper is what I call the elusiveness of facts in the climate change debate. That while it would seem that the easiest thing to do is to resolve a moral quandary is to get your facts straight, it's the ethical principles that are hard to agree on. It's not always an easy matter just getting your facts straight. So I'm going to actually read through a paper and should finish up well within the time. I was going to say I don't wear a watch now, and I rushed out and left my cell phone at home, which I normally use to tell time. So I guess we have a virtually unlimited amount of time for this as a result, since I have no way of knowing. No, obviously I have a computer in front of me, but I'm going to try to finish up in time for some feedback and questions at the end. So let me get started then. Well, is ethics only about ethics? Well, my paper is not primarily intended to target professionals in this field. I should perhaps mention at the outset that there is an area of ethics called metaethics, which focuses on the field of ethics itself as its area and focus of study. It deals with foundational considerations like arriving at proper definitions for the most basic concepts used within the subject, and whether there might in fact be a single correct method for approaching and answering ethical questions. Now, as metaethics centers only on ethics, for this area of the subject, the answer to my question, is ethics only about ethics, is, I'm afraid, a trivial and rather uninteresting yes. If we, however, shift the ground from talking about whether there is a single correct method for answering ethical questions, and not everyone believes that there is, and move on instead to actually using such a method ourselves, then we are out of the area of the merely abstract and theoretical and onto the practical, down-to-earth turf of applied ethics, where you and I live when we make our moral decisions on a daily basis. And it is in the area of applied ethics that we will dwell for most of the remainder of this paper. But first, a brief metaethical discussion on method is in order as it relates to our central question. Without doubt, the most long-standing and entrenched method used for approaching ethical questions and reasoning through them to an answer concerning what we ought to do dates all the way back to ancient Greece and employs a form of reasoning the philosopher Aristotle called a practical syllogism. Considered by many contemporary ethicists to be as relevant today as it was then, it is a pattern of reasoning you have probably used many times yourself without even knowing it. In its essentials, it looks like this. You have a premise which usually is a general moral rule. We ought to keep our promises. We ought not to harm someone. And then there is usually, and here's where the facts come in, an additional premise or premises that have to do with particular facts relating to the situation. Now, this pattern of moral reasoning shows us clearly that applied ethics, then, is not only about ethics. The conclusion about what we ought to do describes our ethical obligations in this pattern, and the role we use as a premise in our argument clearly relates to a moral standard, an abstract moral rule or principle, but tying together this abstract moral standard with our concluded moral obligation in a specific, concrete situation is or are particularly relevant facts relating to the situation in question. Facts not themselves specifically part of ethics proper. Hence, the claim that ethics is not only about ethics. Now, contemporary ethicist William Franklin, and I'm sure he's not with us any longer, but as I said, I used to use his little text on ethics in my courses. William Franklin illustrated Aristotle's practical syllogism with the reasoning process Socrates used to decide whether he should accept his friend's offer to facilitate his escape from prison into exile, thus enabling him to avoid the death sentence which had been meted out to him by the Athenian courts. So even though it was Aristotle who, after Socrates, formulated and gave a name to this type of argument and ethical reasoning, Socrates, before Aristotle, was using it. Effectively using several practical syllogisms, Socrates mulls over issues in prison, like whether he has a moral obligation to keep his agreements, whether he should obey and whether we should obey our parents, and whether we should return harm for harm and retaliation if wronged unjustly. It is important to him that he now do the right thing, not just the prudent thing, because Socrates sincerely believes that harming his soul ethically will have negative repercussions for him, not only in this life, but in the next. It would literally be a fate worse than the imminent death he now faces. To illustrate the practical syllogism in action, one of his arguments might be summarized as follows, and this is pretty similar to the way Franklin has summarized it in his little ethics test. You have a general moral rule. We ought to keep our agreements. But how does that relate to Socrates' own situation? Well, it's particular facts that make it relate. As a citizen, Socrates says, I have an understood agreement with Athens to obey its laws and respect its court's verdicts. And additionally, he reasons that by escaping into exile, he would now, in effect, be overturning the court verdict which sentenced him to death, or he reasons in the first person. Therefore, Socrates concludes I should not escape. Even though the prudent thing to do would be to accept my friend's offer, he thinks it is the morally wrong thing to do. And using similar reasoning, Socrates concludes by bringing in additional factual considerations, such as that the city has indeed been like a parent to him and would in fact be harmed by his escape, and we shouldn't harm our parents or strike back at them, as well as so essential to the city's very existence would be broken by this course of action, by overturning a court verdict. Socrates reasons that he should stay and face his sentence, that he is morally obligated not to escape. Now, whether we agree with Socrates' reasoning or his ultimate moral choice is here not the point. The point is that the most time-honored method for addressing an ethical issue and for reasoning oneself through it to a course of action on a moral question brings into play not only abstract ethical considerations but concrete, particular facts about the world. Part of the process of answering an ethical question by the use of a practical syllogism, therefore, is not just one of figuring out what abstract moral principles might relate to a given situation, but is also one of getting one's facts straight. It is the facts relating to a specific situation that determine whether a moral rule even applies to it. So they're very important in this reasoning pattern. Yet it would seem that the process of getting our facts straight should be the easiest part of resolving a moral quandary. After all, it is facts that are observable and intersubjectively verifiable among persons using empirical methods. Abstract considerations of tastes and values are not. For example, Mary and her college roommate can easily agree on the color of the dress Mary just bought for their big double date this weekend. But they may strongly disagree on whether or not the dress is beautiful and is an issue in aesthetics. Historically, some philosophers, and here I have in mind people like the logical positivists, like the emotive ethicists, historically some philosophers have argued that matters of moral value are like matters of taste, not settlable observationally. Now, while many, if not most, contemporary ethicists have long ago abandoned the stark moral relativism and contempt for moral reasoning that this observation implies, for instance, can I really convince you with abstract reasoning that you should prefer chocolate ice cream to butter pecan? Is rational debate even possible on such matters of taste? And if not on them, then why on moral matters? At any rate, as I said, most ethicists have long ago abandoned this form of reasoning, and they maintain a confidence that it is indeed possible to seek reasoned solutions to moral problems. But that this issue was even raised at all clearly indicates that on the face of it, facts seem a lot easier to confirm and verify than values. Now, the remainder of my paper will be taken up with challenging this initially plausible assumption by focusing at some length on the elusiveness of facts in the current moral debate over climate change. At this point, someone is undoubtedly saying to herself or himself, debate over climate change? I thought that the debate over climate change is now over. A consensus on the issue now existing among reputable scientists in the field. Well, Al Gore notwithstanding, I can assure you that this is decidedly not the case, and that, as Mark Twain might have put it, the death of the climate change debate has been greatly exaggerated. First of all, I want to underscore the importance and centrality of the practical syllogism to the climate change debate through brief reference to a recent study published in the Journal for Activism in Science and Technology Education, in which the authors examined approximately 50 science lessons with a view toward developing recommendations for incorporating ways to integrate more moral reasoning into the climate change curriculum. And this is mostly in high school and middle school science classes. Citing an anthology entitled Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, and agreeing with its editor's claim that, quote, that society has not acted to avert the harms of climate change because the affirmation of moral responsibilities has been missing from public discourse, end of quote. They follow, that is, authors of the study follow these editors' adoption of the practical syllogism as a paradigm for the moral reasoning that will enable us to deduce those moral responsibilities. In the their study, they reproduced the anthology editor's example, and you have it in this slide. The factual premise: if we do not act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes, and let's face it, it is anthropogenic, human-caused global warming that is the main focus of the issue, right? Because it is presumably anthropogenic global warming that we can have an effect on by modifying our behavior through personal behavior modification and policy decisions. So that's what's at issue. So factual premise then: if we do not act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future, basically the future of the planet. The moral premise: we have a moral obligation to avert harms to the future, so as to leave a world as rich in life and possibility as the world we inherited. And then the conclusion: therefore, we have a moral obligation to act, and act now, to mitigate the supposed negative effects of climate change. Now, a few pages later, authors of the study reinforce their adoption and recommendation of the practical syllogism as the best model for ethical argumentation on climate change by offering one of their own. Here, their factual premise is carbon dioxide emissions worsen the effect of climate change on future generations, or they give some other options you could put in there to formulate parallel practical syllogisms. The moral premise: we have a moral obligation not to do things that will harm future generations. Hence the conclusion: we have a moral obligation to reduce our carbon emissions. Now, readers, and hopefully those of you who are in the audience, should see that except for the order of the premises, this is the same form of argument I presented earlier as the practical syllogism. And in this type of syllogism, the order of the premises does not affect the argument. Well, on to some specific stuff about climate change. A good central starting point for our discussion of the debate, and one from which one can branch out in other directions, is a little piece penned a few years ago by renowned meteorologist Joe Bastardi, who I have respected for years, because usually when they interview this guy and he gives you projections, I mean, more often than right, whether it's projections for the hurricane season or how bad a winter we're going to have, he usually is dead on the money. And so at any rate, while making it clear that he is speaking for himself in the piece and not his longtime employer AccuWeather, he laments the fact that defenders of anthropogenic, that is man-caused global warming, have tried to stifle debate on the issue and have reached wrong conclusions, in his opinion, by failing to get their facts straight in two principal ways. Number one, they have ignored well-documented and observationally confirmed facts from the past, especially those concerning ocean regime changes and their clear effect on the weather. And two is very important because I spend a good deal of time on it, because it's very central to the whole issue. And two, they have too often treated the projections of computer models as fact. And treating them as fact, they basically place those projections in practical syllogisms as the factual premises of arguments. This is why we're focusing so much on the models. Well, Bastardi says if we take into account the, quote, cold hard facts, end of quote, obtained from observation, he contends that we have more reason to conclude that the world is in fact in for a 15 to 20 year period of global cooling, not global warming, as signaled by the similarity of the 2007 La Nina to one which occurred in 1950 through 51 and reversed the 30-year warming trend to a cooling period which extended throughout most of the 1960s. And I remember, you can tell I'm not 25, I remember growing up, winters were a lot worse. I mean, routinely, I have pictures of my brother and I, and I was thinking of throwing one up there, but they thought better of it. You know, storming with snow this high, you know, in front of our house. You know, so I grew up in this cooling period in my early years. At any rate, what meteorologist Bastardi wants to point out is that there are climate cycles, and the facts tell us that, quote, what is occurring now has occurred before. This first colder than normal year worldwide, and he writes a few years ago, is one of the signs that we're getting ready to go back to a colder cycle on the order of 15 to 20 years. They show us that in the end, it is nature, not man, that will have its way with the weather. Now, other research bears Bastardi out on this, and I don't really go into this, but just to mention it, for instance, a 2007 article entitled "A New Dynamical Mechanism for Major Climate Shifts" contends that ocean oscillations could alone account for most of the Earth's warming and cooling over the past 15 years. And as well, some meteorologists of some note have recently agreed with Bastardi's position on this. And I downloaded some things on the internet, but essays are not like chicken soup. With chicken soup, the more you add to it, it can only make it better. Essays aren't that way, so I left some stuff out. At any rate, evidencing some of the shortcomings of these models to account for ocean regime changes, Bastardi cites their predictive failures relating to then recent La Nina, El Nino patterns. On these changes, he says the models, to put it in his own words, are clueless. But his main point then, which I read past, but is worth reading, is that he claims that defenders of anthropogenic global warming would rather discard or ignore facts of the past relating to recurring climate patterns and instead place their faith in future projections made by computer models, and again use these projections as if they were established fact. Next paragraph, a far more extensive and technical analysis of the shortcomings of computer models for making climate predictions, especially for those relied on extensively by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has been offered by Christopher Monckton in the newsletter on the Forum on Physics and Society. This really ruffled some feathers when it came out. Well, the technical details, and it is a very intensely technical scientific paper, I'm reading out some of the more understandable and ethically related points from it. Well, the technical details of this landmark 2007 challenge to the veracity of IPCC model projections lies well beyond the scope of this paper. I think that we can understand the main point he makes, which is that the IPCC's methodology, this is Monckton, relies unduly, indeed almost exclusively, upon numerical analysis even where the outputs of the models upon which it so heavily relies are manifestly and significantly at variance with theory or observation or both. Model projections, such as those upon which the IPCC's entire case rests, have long been proven impossible when applied to mathematically chaotic objects such as the climate, whose initial state can never be determined to a sufficient precision. One of the points we make when we discuss hard determinism in philosophy class is there's a view that holds that everything, including your decisions, are so determined that you have no free will. But you say, well, wait a second, Professor Murawski, you don't know what I'm going to do, what choices I'm going to make when I leave this room. You can't predict what I'm going to do. Doesn't that mean I make free choices? Well, they would say, well, no. All of your movements would be in principle predictable if we knew enough about the initial state and your causal history. But as a matter of fact, that's so complex that I don't know it, and hence I can't make future predictions about what you're going to do this afternoon. Now I don't frankly accept that kind of hard determinism, but a similar point here applies. If the initial state is so complex that you can't get it right in your models, as computer people have held for years, garbage in, garbage out. You know, if you can't get the initial state right, your projections are not going to be right, and this is his main point. Now, specifically, where does Monckton think that the IPCC projections have gone wrong due to their overly optimistic reliance on computer models inadequate to the task of making long-range climate projections for such a complex and mathematically chaotic object. The central question in the scientific debate over whether and to what extent, if any, human beings have warmed the climate since the start of the Industrial Revolution, notes Monckton, revolves around the notion of climate sensitivity, which is, and you have it defined on the slide in front of you, the magnitude of the change in T sub s, which is the globally averaged land and sea surface absolute temperature, a real mouthful, after doubling CO2 concentration from the pre-industrial 278 parts per million to approximately 550 parts per million. In other words, what you do is you take the 1750 pre-industrial levels of carbon, particles, 278 parts per million roughly, and then to forecast things for your models, you double that and say, well, now our CO2 levels are approximately twice as high, so let's double that and see what projections the models make with regard to temperature change. So that's what's going on here, because it might not be immediately obvious to people not familiar with this debate. Now, it is precisely in predicting this temperature change, TS, accurately, that IPCC computer models have fallen far short of actual observed values. The then most current comprehensive statement from the IPCC on this was contained in its fourth assessment report. That is the then in 2007. Excuse me. Which estimated the likely rise in T sub S in response to sustained industrial CO2 levels of 550 parts per million at roughly a temperature rise of between 2 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. The IPCC contention is that human activity, especially that productive of CO2 emissions, has been responsible for more than half of this projected temperature rise and will continue to contribute to a similar level of temperature rise in the future, of course with serious negative effects, unless significant steps are taken through policies and agreements to mitigate the situation by curtailing worldwide CO2 emissions. But the factual premise supporting the moral argument for immediate and perhaps drastic action worldwide to attempt to head off the supposed dire consequences of climate change rests on the veracity of the models. As partial evidence supporting the deep flaws in their projection, Monkton at the time cited the following diagram representing an early 1988 attempt, and this is a very famous, I don't know if it was exactly the first climate projection model, but it was certainly one of the first, representing an early 1988 attempt to predict the effects of CO2 emissions on the rise of T sub S through the year 2020. While not itself generated by the IPCC, it pretty much concurred with that report's findings. And you'll see D is the IPCC's parallel projected findings. And let me read, because you can't see it very well because it's in black text, but you might be able to read it on your handout. But I'm going to read my summary of it because I try to put out the main points of this chart. James Hansen, NASA, its author, presented this chart before Congress then, using it to underscore his case for urgent action to prevent the projected temperature rise represented in lines B and C. So D is the IPCC's computer model projections, and B and C are Hansen's. And you can see they pretty much concur that there will be a significant rise in T sub S. So at any rate, as I said, Hansen presented this before Congress and used it to underscore his case for urgent action to prevent the projected temperature rise represented in B through C above in the IPCC, based on its own model projections, was right in there as well as seen from D. His contention then was that decisive global action on curbing CO2 concentrations would stabilize the situation at a much lower level represented by A, that green line on your chart, thus avoiding the projected temperature rise with its attendant negative consequences. But the bottom line factual point illustrated by the above graph is that the actual global temperature rise based on observational evidence through 2007, and that's why you get everything is a solid line down below up to 2007, and then the dotted lines are projections past it. At any rate, the main point was that the actual global temperature rise then represented was by contrast much lower. This is represented by the red line E and F. Much lower and indeed closer to the stabilized figure Hansen hoped to achieve only if significant reductions in CO2 emissions were attained, all taking place during a period of rapid rise in CO2 emissions. In other words, the much feared projected warming was just not happening. Now, we need not be content, however, with looking at quarter-century-old charts to see the flaws in the IPCC's modeled projections. With the benefit of hindsight, we can make the same case from the most recent data available out of its own publications. Actual observations since 2007, as we shall see, have continued to undermine the veracity of its modeled projections of significant warming. First of all, though, a 2012 look back at the Hansen-NASA model, so the one we just left is 1988. This is an analysis of the Hansen's temperature scenario, the green line at the top. At any rate, this 2012 look back continues to show the model's predicted failures as warming has continued only modestly, much on the same line observed by Monkton in 2007. So these black lines at the bottom are the actual warming. The blue line, scenario C, is if you look down at the end, scenario C represents global temperatures if CO2 emissions, according to Hansen, had been limited to 2000, year 2000 CO2 emission levels. So he's saying we can get temperatures down to that blue line, but actual observations say that even without making the changes he predicted, actual temperatures have been closer to that blue line than to the computer model predictions up there. So this is Hansen's model. Actual data, then, in contrast to what Hansen predicted with his NASA model, not only has not shown the significant warming he projected, but has actually shown a slight cooling trend, a fall in T-sub-S in recent years, which, of course, takes us back to Basveldi's forecast that we might be in for an era of cooling. Compare this model's predicted failures with that of a similar one used by the IPCC, whose parallel projections of significant warming have also not materialized as discerned from actual observational data. So here again, we get the IPCC's model, and basically, these lines, if you see FAR, SAR, TAR, these are the first three assessment reports from the IPCC and their projections made. And by the way, the fifth one is coming out, and some of it has been leaked out. And there are controversies regarding it, but I decided not to go there as I had enough for the time allotted. But at any rate, note how much lower then are the actual observed temperatures from those projected by the IPCC's model. Here again, I'll read it because I know it's not visible on there. Purple dots and lines are actual annual global temperatures. blue, green, and red lines represent IPCC global temperature predictions for business as usual CO2 emissions. In other words, the ones up top are their projections if we don't take any drastic action. There's where the models predict that it will go. But again, especially if you look at the purplish observed results, they just haven't gone there. In fact, they're much closer. The commitment represents global temperatures if CO2 emissions have been limited to agreed upon 2000 levels. That is, if we take drastic action to curb CO2 emissions, take them back to what they were in the year 2000. So in other words, the orange line is where they hope to go only if we take drastic measures internationally. The three lines at top is where they say it would go if we don't, but the purplish line, whatever color that is, I'm not colorblind, but that's somewhere between purple and pink, represents actual observed temperatures during the period, which are essentially even below what they predicted. Well, one more chart here. Another chart of ISS satellite global temperature measurements confirms that there's been, in fact, a cooling trend worldwide since 1997. That is, we have, since then, 184 months of cooling, not warming, as predicted by NASA and IPCC models. And that's this slide, which basically shows that if you look at the black line, the point is the temperatures have been stable or even falling, yet the black line, which you see is ascending steadily, represents the level of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and so this leveling off and even slightly decreased temperature change has happened in the face of steadily rising atmospheric CO2 levels, represented by the black line in the chart. Interestingly, after presenting this graph, the author, as we have done, takes pains to point out explicitly that, quote, the slight cooling trend is opposite of what the IPCC and NASA's James Hansen predicted for global temperatures. As well, he presents in some detail the main factual premise in the moral argument over climate change as an hypothesis which needs support from modeled projections which clearly have now failed. And so I thought his... Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I put that in. But here's what he says. This is kind of a summary of the whole case. The IPCC prediction of rapid global warming is based on the hypothesis that human CO2 emissions would increase atmospheric CO2 greenhouse gas levels. The increase of greenhouse gases would allow more radiated heat to be retained. The retained heat would warm the atmosphere, and the atmosphere would then warm the world's oceans and land masses, hence the increase in TS, the average land and sea surface temperature. And that such predicted warming would set in motion a, quote, runaway tipping point, end of quote, that would produce catastrophic climate disasters and a doomsday for civilization. Now compare this with the factual premises we looked at earlier, and these are in your earlier handout towards the beginning. One, the one from the anthology. If we do not act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future, and also carbon dioxide emissions worsen the effects of climate change on future generations. That is, the main factual premise in the moral argument for dramatic and urgent action on climate change becomes an hypothesis whose main support, coming from computer-modeled projections, has been undermined by observational evidence. Curiously, Hansen has been in the news within the past year. Curiously, NASA's Hansen has made recent news with a moral argument whose factual premise is essentially the second one listed above, arguing, quote, that current generations have an overriding moral duty to their children and grandchildren to take immediate action, end of quote, to curb the supposed dire consequences of human-induced climate change. Hansen calls this, quote, an issue of intergenerational justice on a par with ending slavery, end of quote. But we've just seen that as empirical evidence shows that the global temperature rise as predicted by his model will not follow, then neither will the destructive consequences, presumably, he thinks we will bring on future generations through our greenhouse gas emissions. Hence, the crusade he wants to start for the adoption of a carbon tax worldwide to effect a 6% reduction in CO2 emissions seems as a consequence to lack his claimed moral foundation. If there is no such emergency, then there is no legitimate moral argument supporting such dire emergency measures, the factual premise of any such argument being false, and the factual premise here coming from computer model projections, his own and the IPCC's, among others. Some of the more diplomatic defenders, this is my last paragraph, we're on the home stretch. Some of the more diplomatic defenders of the model projections and the clear variance of their predictions with observational data have described the unexpected stasis in warming over the past 15 years or so as simply a period in which global warming is, quote, at a standstill. Obviously then leaving open the door that it may resume again at any time. This, of course, raises a specter of whether this attempt to save their hypothesis from falsification by observational data is not, in fact, akin to the attempt of Ptolemaic astronomers to save their own view of the heavens from falsification by observational evidence through the use of the artificial device of epicycles to explain the retrograde motion of some planets. In other words, if the planets are really out there stuck on crystalline spheres, as the Aristotelian-influenced Ptolemaic astronomy theory said, when we track a planet across the sky during the months, through the zodiac, through the constellations of the zodiac, the planet should just go straight across. What they actually observed observationally is that, and Thomas Kuhn has several books on this, the Copernican revolution being one of them. What they actually observed was that the planet doubles back on itself. Now that shouldn't be happening if the planet is stuck out there on a crystalline sphere. So what did they do? Did they give up as observationally falsified Ptolemaic astronomy? No, they tried to patch the theory up and basically said, let's introduce epicycles. They're small spheres, and the planet is really on the small sphere, which goes in the opposite direction, and that's what accounts for retrograde motion. Is this an attempt to patch up the theory that becomes a hedge which in the end will will fail to do its job much as Epicycles did. But thank you very much for your patience. I really appreciate it. And I know this is sort of a contrarian perspective, but sometimes philosophers have to be gadflies. So,
Thank you.
go ahead.
I believe it's
Okay.
here. So you have okay.
Yeah. Okay, for any of my students who came in late, there's an attendance sheet at the back of that aisle that you can sign. And also, there might be some handouts left over. I only made 30 of them. My apologies. But thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
The data was very interesting. You got it from all internet?
Yeah. Most of it. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh,